Hello here. Hello, everybody, and I'm here with The Snake Was Right. He's a relatively new YouTuber here on um, the section of YouTube where we dialogue about things with regards to philosophy of religion, things with regards to evolution, creation, all those interesting topics. And today we're going to be discussing the rationality and morality of Christian belief and many of the things that relate to that. It's going to be a pretty free-form discussion. And I'll just let him say however much he wants with regards to some sort of introduction. I don't know if I can't hear him, but yeah. Are you there? No, sounds like he's coming back.
All right, sorry, I'm back.
All right, I just started it, and I just
Okay.
basically explained the topic.
Okay.
You can say a few words if you'd like.
All right. So my position on it is basically my channel name is The Snake Was Right, because the knowledge of good and evil is a good thing to have, and so I don't really understand the whole mentality behind telling Adam and Eve not to do something, which is he obviously expected them to obey. But they had no knowledge of what good and evil was, so how are they supposed to obey and know that that was a bad thing? And I guess that's a good place to start, right at the beginning.
All right. So I guess we're gonna go right to the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
I think first of all, this assumes that everything the serpent was saying was in essence true, that God is some sort of cosmic killjoy that's trying to keep good from you. And from a Christian perspective, I would say that God's plan from Adam and Eve was to enjoy God with good, because I would say God would be the source of good, and in allowing them to choose good and evil, his intention was for them to not choose evil, and the disobedience was that first act of evil that allowed them to know how to disobey. And I don't really see a reason behind why their disobedience was good, because it led to a number of bad decisions on the part of the human race.
So I don't understand how they could have chosen, at least in the sense of informed consent, because they had no knowledge of what they were doing.
Well, they did have the knowledge of whether or not they wanted to continue on as they had the prior knowledge of what life with without evil was like.
But they had no idea what would bring evil unless they had the knowledge of evil, right?
Can you say it one more time? You sort of cut out.
It seems that they would have no knowledge of evil or good before eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right?
They would have knowledge of good, and there's really no say one way or the other if they knew what the concept of evil was. But the majority of exegetes who have looked at the text would say that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was essentially the idea that they knew how to disobey God. That's the knowledge that they were gaining.
So if his intention was for them to choose not to eat it, and he knows what's going to happen, and he can design anything and educate them in any knowledge that they need, what was the point of setting it up that way. I mean, I guess it would be useful to understand how literally you interpret the Bible, because some people think it was
With regard
literally a fruit. Some people
with
just think it's
regards
all a
to
metaphor.
I'm not I don't really take a position on the literal nature of the tree. I don't know how I find it unlikely that the tree with the fruit actually has anything to do with um, their choosing the knowledge of good and evil. It's more of a um, it's more of a concept of what their choice would be, and why wouldn't God make it another way? Because there is intrinsic value in allowing creatures to make free choices.
But shouldn't they be fully informed? Because you're not even allowed to sign a contract if you're drunk. But these people didn't seem to know what they were doing.
Fully informed of what?
Um, Basically the consequences. I mean, he said they will die, but they
That they
seem
will
pretty
that they will die.
naive about that. Seems almost like they didn't believe him.
Okay, so you're saying that God should have orchestrated a plan in which they were still free, not limiting their human freedom in any way, yet um, make it so obvious to them as to not choose that?
Yeah, he even could have just created four people and let two of them watch the other two fail, and then those other two would understand better.
Okay, so with regards to the concept of
Or
free choice,
anything. I mean, a parent would not let their child fail like that. They would hold their hand for as long as was needed until that child was able to make responsible,
well,
independent decisions.
we don't really know how long um, they had in the Garden of Eden, um, being with God and having the pleasure of walking with God in that sense. Um, but in a sense, I don't see how one could not be limiting human freedom by um, essentially babying them in the way that they knew exactly um, what the consequences would be. Like that would sort of defeat the purpose of um, their blank choice of either obeying what the person they loved said or um, disobeying that and essentially saying to them, essentially listening to the serpent and saying that um, they would be their own gods. Like that was the big statement that the serpent says that would make them um, gods like God. So that it was essentially a selfish thing. Like they I think that there's no reason to believe that they didn't understand the concept of that being a selfish thing because they chose it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I look at it is, I mentioned informed consent before, because the way I see it, you're limiting human freedom if you're not given all the information you need or all the experience you need. And like, let's say that the snake was lying to them and manipulating them. I feel like they deserve to be heard out to
How would
say,
they
well,
understand
we were
evil with
tricked. What's that?
how would you have them understand evil without them experiencing evil?
Well, as it could be as simple as just a temporary experience.
Well, once there's the choice of knowing what evil is and being able to choose it, you're still in the same sort of scenario.
Yeah, I'm still a little bit hung up on whether or not they're able to understand good and evil before taking the fruit.
For taking the fruit. So it all depends on what the concepts of good and evil mean. Um, if evil is simply the lack of good, um, I think that is easy enough of a concept for someone to understand, especially if they had years of experiencing um, the good. We don't like from a Christian perspective, we don't know how long they were in the garden before that and how long they had of God teaching them. During this time, they had learned all about animals. They were learning about a number of things. Um, so we don't know exactly how much knowledge they had of these things, good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil, where we're talking about in Genesis 3, I think 3 verse 5 or something, is more referring to teaching them how to disobey.
Yeah, I understand that aspect, but it does seem like they were enlightened to something after they ate the fruit because they covered up and they realized they were naked. So something occurred to them that had never occurred to before, right after taking the
Right, which was
fruit,
shame.
or disobeying God, which maybe awakened some
Mhm.
deep rebellion that was always within them
Yeah.
or something.
If I could bounce off that, the big concept you have to remember when looking at um, most of the texts within the compilation of the Bible is that we're looking at an honor-shame culture as opposed to our Western culture, which is associated with pride and guilt. They dealt more in terms of honor and shame. And the vast majority of exegetes look at Genesis 3 um, and look at their putting the fig leaves on, etc., as a demonstration of their shame of having disobeyed God. That was what their knowledge was of shame.
So they immediately came to regret it.
Um, Shame is more of an inward thing. So I would say, I mean, shame is more of an outward thing. So I would say they regretted it as soon as they realized um, what they were doing was against what God um, had intended for them. They were going against their original purpose.
So I'd say it seems like they learned their lesson there.
Sorry, I did not hear you.
It seems like they learned their lesson there already. They were already regretting what they had done.
Right, but they still hadn't experienced um, evil experientially, and that sin had to, like that. You would agree that disobeying God in that circumstance would have been categorized as a sin.
Uh, I believe that you would categorize it as a sin. I'm not sure what a sin really should be
Just
because
talking about
it's
within the
just
perspective of what the biblical data for sin would be.
yeah.
Uh, so, if God is indeed a just being who wants to teach humanity things about um, reality, it would just be like any parent punishing um, their child for doing something wrong, and and I think that you, then you have to take into account the whole of human history, in addition to the atonement, to look back at Genesis 3 with the best possible lens.
Well, but we could teach lessons to people just with picture books or movies. They don't need to see it themselves. The horrors of war and
I
all
wouldn't
kinds of
agree
that.
that you wouldn't have to have experiential knowledge in that sense in order to really learn from um, your actions, in order to understand um, what the pain of sin is like, because people don't really realize. Some people might realize it, but people don't really think a lot of um, the pain God experiences from sin that people commit, and God is essentially um, uh, through punishing people, not only expressing justice, but letting one know how God feels, and letting them know how it feels to choose something other than God.
Well, it's a bit draconian, though, isn't it? I mean, I'm not exactly asking for a slap on the wrist, but eternal damnation of all life is a bit harsh for one little disobedience.
Not eternal damnation of all life.
Well, okay, well, I was talking to a Nephilim free, and he believes that
Yes,
all
here
life
we go.
is
Yes,
condemned.
this
Everything's
is where
gonna
we want to go.
die. Yeah, but it does seem. I mean, there are a whole lot of nasty things out there killing each other, and a lot of extinct animals, and they suffer just like we do.
I wouldn't say that animals suffer in the same way that
It's
we do.
not
I don't
they
think
suffer, but
I don't think that the self-awareness of embodied moral agents um,
of course, but
is equal to the suffering um, of animals.
But all you have to do is look into the eyes of a little dog or cat to
Yes.
understand there's something there. It still experiences pain and pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are a number of morally sufficient reasons for which this would happen under a theistic worldview. But we can definitely get into that. But I did want to push back on the notion of hell that was presented in your last discussion with
Okay. Yeah.
Nephilim Free, because I think that's one of the cruxes of where the feeling of unfairness comes from with regards to the Christian story. Would you agree with that?
That's definitely a major component. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Um,
One of the two
and
main ones, I think.
yeah, and I think that if the notion that Nephilim was pushing with regards to hell is indeed correct, that would provide a problem for the punishment for sin that was given in the Garden of Eden. And I certainly understand why you think that that might be an issue under the under that specific Christian paradigm. So I did want to ask you a question. What do you think the from a Christian perspective? What do you think hell is?
It depends. I don't know if I mentioned this to you yet. I went to Catholic high school,
Mm,
so I'm pretty familiar with a lot of different perspectives.
mhm.
Um, Kind of the perspective they pushed there was like hell is it's just kind of you don't cease to exist, but you're existing away from God, which is inherently painful. Nephilim's is a little bit strange because it's fire and brimstone, but it's not because he believes you're just snuffed out like that. You don't actually go to hell to
Right.
be
I think he
tortured.
holds to some form of annihilation.
Yeah. There's the classic burning in hell, tortured by demons. I think very few people actually believe that anymore.
Yeah, that was really
Um,
just that's really based on Dante's Inferno more than anything else.
well, and the Bible does mention the lake of fire, and
Yeah.
Islam really goes
Yeah.
into that. You'll have your skin peeled off and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
they
The
really hold to that.
the
Um,
idea of fire. First of all, we're mostly dealing here with the New Testament concept of hell, because in the Old Testament you didn't really have much. You had a couple verses in Daniel thrown out there. But fire, a number of scholars have noted, is very often um, used in uh, the context of the judgment of God. Um, that's why hell is also described as darkness, with darkness being the judgment and separation from God. So I can't think of a major scholar out there who actually believes that the fire would be literal. Um, the Bible clearly uses metaphors to refer to hell. They talk about hell's worm and a number of things like that, in contrast with um, the light of God and the water of God's Spirit. So that's the dichotomy being drawn with regards to the ontological nature of hell. Um, are you familiar with C.S. Lewis's view of hell?
uh, you're gonna have to remind me.
That's the
I have read
idea. Yeah.
like the Chronicles of Narnia and stuff.
Yeah, this would be in his I don't know where to call it, a book or a large essay on it's called The Great Divorce. And his view of hell is, I think that it's very biblically based. Um, that the doors of hell are essentially locked from the inside, um, and that hell being separation from God is people who choosingly reject God, and they start altogether slowly just grumbling about how their existence is uh, based on um, their own selfish desires, and how much they wish that God would have done this, and they wish that they would have done this, and they like all of their um, gripes with God are being mentioned, and slowly they start to get sick of each other and move further and further away from each other, thus making um, hell uh, such an awful place to be, as total separation from the light of God. And when you take this in conjunction with the honor shame paradigm that I mentioned of the New Testament context, you've got people that are movingly further and further away from God, who is the exemplar of honor, which is one of the highest goods. Um, and they're separating themselves. Thus, the more honor degradation and shame um, there is in hell. So it would essentially be a self-inflicted pain.
All right, so the unfair part to me is, why is that like a permanent state? Why can't you unreject God at any point? Why can't you change your mind? Like, why would the doors be locked?
Yes, yes.
Because
Um,
I don't know if you heard the whole debate with Nephilim, but he brought up the parable of the prodigal son.
yes, yes. This is good.
Um, so wouldn't a father want to accept his son back, no matter where he's been, no matter how long he's blasphemed his father, no matter what he want? If
Absolutely,
you Okay,
absolutely.
so yeah, I'm just
That's why
assuming.
I do not think that God permanently would makes hell. I don't think God locks hell. I think that
Okay,
there are two views that are um, fine with the biblical data. The first would be that people do essentially um, realize the error of their ways after a finite time in hell. And I think philosopher Eleanor Stump made a good analogy of there being a bus that goes back and forth from heaven and hell, of people in hell realizing, you know what, maybe I do want to accept um, Christ as my identity, and I can slowly start the refining the refining process of my soul in heaven, and that would be one view. And I'll tell you why that's biblically supported. It might be biblically supported in a second. And the other um, is the view that God has no problem with people um, choosing to repent even after death, but that people choose not to. That they would rather um, that they would rather uh, allow themselves to be their own lords, allow their own wills to be done instead of loving God. And there are certainly a lot of atheists that I've talked to. Certainly not all, but there are a lot of atheists, both in popular culture, academia, and regular life, who say that they would choose hell over heaven, precisely because they prefer um, the concept of running their own lives. Um, so I would I back to the first one with people coming out of hell. I would cite the verses that speak to uh, the eternal punishment in hell are often using a word. And I would prefer not to have to get into the Greek text here, but I'll just assure you, and you can look this up if you want. But the word being used there is referring to an age of time. It doesn't always refer to something eternal, but it is often referring to an age of time. The word used for the eternal punishment of hell is the same word used of Jonah being trapped in the belly of the fish in the book of Jonah, and that clearly wasn't an eternal thing. So the Bible, it seemed to at least be leaving open the possibility of universalism. There really isn't that much biblical material on hell. Um, comparatively to other subjects. But from what we have, I don't see any biblical data that contradicts either view that I presented.
okay, that's interesting. But as far as like original sin, so you kind of believe that that came from the fall in the garden, right?
Generally, I do take a little bit of a different view with regards to Adam and Eve than most young Earth creationists do, though I think it is compatible with creationism. I would say that Adam and Eve were um, uh, whether literal or not, were representatives of the best pure humans that God could create that have human freedom, essentially, that they were the best representatives that God, in his middle knowledge, could feasibly create.
It just seems like it would be more fair if every person was allowed to make that choice or take that test.
Yes, we are.
Because, I mean, there's some people who would never question any kind of authority at any point.
This
That
is
exists now.
absolutely true. This is why we are all given free choice. It just happened. I don't think that original sin is I don't think that original sin is prescriptive. I think it's descriptive of all of our conditions. I think that inevitably everybody chooses to take the apple, essentially. Anytime they don't build their identity on God and they build their identity upon something else that isn't God, that's the real sin of selfishness and idolatry.
All right. So if I were God, I would maybe like set up an office where I could do therapy sessions with people, something like that.
I didn't catch the
'Cause
first part of your statement. I didn't understand what you just said.
I'm just trying to think of there's a million better ways to do this coming into my head. Like if I had all the knowledge and all the power in the world, I would create some kind of center where I could meet with the people I created and give them therapy.
Yes, this is another thing that would be pretty compatible with the Christian picture because we have that in two different ways, potentially even three. Um, you're just saying that to provide people with more information of
Well, you said
their
they
choices, right?
everybody has a condition that will cause them to sin at some point in some way, and
I would say I'm not using condition in a clinical sense there. Um,
yeah,
I was I'm more referring to sin being I mean sin being a descriptive act of what we're actually doing, and not that we are um, immediately condemned from the moment of birth um, with this original sin. I think that if any of us were put in the same situation as Adam and Eve, that we would have picked the same thing at some point. At some point, as imperfect people who make free choices that are not always what God wants. Um, at some point, everyone would have uh, disobeyed God in that sense. And
so
uh,
it just seems like there's everything's being treated as exactly the same severity. Like saying cursing out your parents is on the same level as going on a murder spree.
yeah, this is in the category of rewards in heaven, essentially. Um, the just to bring it into the cultural context of the time period we're talking about a very class heavy um, time period, especially in New Testament times where they're actually talking about the afterlife. uh, Very class oriented society where you've got um, a number of different positions one can have in society, and a hierarchy of senses.
Well,
And
this is more of a problem in like the Quran because it claims to be perfect and unerring
yes,
in
yes,
every way. But
and
it
literally the
seems,
words from God, not
yeah,
just inspired, but God Himself talking.
yes, yeah.
That's a big problem.
But it seems like a lot of, if not all holy books, have this problem to some extent of it should be easily communicated to people of any time if if it
Pretends to be have serious knowledge or to be taken seriously by all peoples at all times.
That what would be communicated easily.
The message of God through the whatever holy text of whatever religion we're talking about. But it seems like they're always describing antiquated civilizations, and there's all this mental footwork that even it's probably true that the context you're pointing out, but it should be easily and readily intelligible to anyone of any time.
I think that I think it should be noted that everyone needs a different amount of explanation. So I think that a lot of people who haven't really thought as deeply about the issues have understood the message. Like I don't think that the message is that hard to understand if you are just looking at it on a surface level. But I think that God also allows for those who want to think deeper to study the proper cultural context and the proper evidence behind these things and the philosophy. I think that there is compatibility with both views here. Like I think that the gospel message is generally easy to explain to to children, even as if the right person's doing it, obviously. But I don't find anything too complicated in the Christian message.
Well, assuming that's all true, it's the problem is just that it distracts people like me who look at it as just another primitive religion, just like all the other ones that have the same ancient civilizations.
Yeah. You're talking more about why would there be influence of culture upon the Holy Book?
Sort of in a way, but I'm just trying to get to it's kind of obscured behind that culture, whereas it's even if it's real, it seems to people like me that it's just some other story because it's just some other guys from some ancient region just saying what they believe, and we
All
have
right, I see
we
what
have
you're saying.
lots of examples of those.
All right, yeah, I see what you're saying. So the proper response then for the Christian would be talking about the uniqueness of the Christian message, and
Yeah.
there I'd more point to the character of Jesus. I don't think there's a comparable character.
But it gets more complex the more and more you go on. It should like it seems designed almost to confuse people who are skeptical by nature.
That does bring up a good quote that I have somewhere of Pascal saying, and I think this is really in accord with human freedom. That there is by the way, this is all seeming to turn into a conversation about evidence and about how much evidence we should expect of the claims that the text is making of its general truth.
Mhm.
That there is enough evidence to satisfy those who genuinely want to believe, and not enough to compel anyone who doesn't want to believe. Essentially, that you aren't that you aren't violating your human freedom to believe this stuff, and form an improper relationship with God.
Well, I actually do want to believe. I mean, I don't. It's not that I want to believe; it's that I want it to be true. And then I guess
All right,
my belief would go along with that.
did.
I think an afterlife would be the greatest news of all time.
I did get that feeling in your debate with Nephilim, and that's originally the reason I reached out, because it seemed like you are open to the evidence, that it doesn't seem like you are somehow have these huge objections that, like, even if this is true, I don't want it to be true.
Yeah,
Similar.
I went into Catholic school completely just neutral. Came out
Similar
an
to
atheist.
similar to a yeah, I don't liken you to someone similar to like a Thomas Nagel, who says something that he doesn't want the universe to be like that. He finds comfort in the idea of death being the end, and comfort in the abyss.
Oh no, that's
Essentially,
horrible. That's
I
the worst.
I am. It depends on my mood, essentially, but sometimes I tend to agree with you on that. So I do want to make one more little point about hell before we transition onto a discussion of hiddenness in the evidence. Um, one of the things that Nephilim brought up in response to your openness was to simply say that you believe in God.
Yeah, that's
And
ridiculous.
I do not think that that is the correct way of saying it, even with what he's trying to say.
Yeah,
I think that Romans 1, the verse he was quoting about the attributes of God being obvious, essentially. I don't think that that at all compels one to think that Paul is saying that everyone thus believes that God exists. He knew plenty of pagans who didn't. Um,
or
I
compels
don't,
me to believe it because Bible quotes are not evidence in themselves.
yeah, yeah,
You have to
certainly, yeah.
prove the Bible before, you know.
Yeah, I'm not. I wasn't playing the Bible. I was
Yeah,
trying
I
point
was
not to.
criticizing Nephilim more.
Yeah, I got you. But I do think there's an element of truth to what he says, what he's trying to say. Not at all in what he said, but in what he's trying to say, which I think is supported by human psychology, that everyone often tends to believe what they want to believe. This is not like a catch-all case, but generally, people do tend to believe what they want to believe.
And I try very hard not to do that
Yes,
like
I agree.
I'm aware of it every moment.
So I do think there needs there needs to be both an open examination of the evidence while also realizing that everyone, no matter of their perspective, whether any sort of cognitive dissonance, um, will inevitably come into play. And even from an atheist perspective, of someone who wants to believe that God exists, it took me a long time to get to the position that theism was true. Because of the fact that um, I had already built these relationships in these atheist communities with people. I had already, and by the way, I was realizing this after the fact that there was a sense of pride in that I wanted to be right about something. It's difficult to change worldviews, no matter your perspective, no matter how much you might want the other side to be correct. It's difficult to change your worldview in that sense. That there's a lot of baggage that comes with it.
Yeah, but I mean, I have done 180s on a lot of things. For example, I used to be a fairly rabid socialist, and now I'm as capitalist as you can be.
All right, all right.
Uh, yeah, I used to proudly wear the Soviet regalia. I but I kind of convinced myself.
Mm-hmm.
It might have been different if someone was trying to convince me, but
Yeah, I certainly see what you're saying. Um, I think it's a little hard with economic beliefs because I don't think one is as personally invested in that.
that is typical, though. People are usually socialists when they're young
That
and
that's
grow
also
out of it.
that's also true. Um, yeah, I was in that phase as well, and I mean, once you take a basic economics class, I mean, it sort of collapses. Um, anyway, we don't really need to get into economics.
Seems like we agree there.
We do. Um, and I think that before we get into the evidence, I just want to make it clear that biases also can be unconscious in a sense. In that, as much as one may say they're open to the evidence, I just want to make sure in all cases that we realize that that bias does come into play, and that uh, there is a general tendency to defend one's theory rather than to immediately jump into another camp.
Yeah. I try to break myself of having any feeling of identity
This is
in
good.
that.
Yes.
Just because that's how it happened. You feel like it's a personal attack. But for the question of God, I actually do have a bias, and I would be biased to believe in God.
All right. I think that means that it is time to look at the evidence. I think that's what brings one to belief. For the more, I think pretty much for everybody. I think that with regards to theism, whether or not you have good evidence, everyone thinks that they have evidence. for either naturalism or polytheism or theism, wherever you land on the spectrum. So I think that a discussion of the evidence is the best way to go about deciding which one is true, obviously.
Okay. Is that the main thing you wanted to talk about?
I mean, I could go there. I can go wherever.
I think that would be interesting, and if we could maybe touch on like objective morality.
Sure. Just
If we have time.
yeah, sure. I definitely have some things to say and many things to learn with regards to meta ethics as sort of a who's relatively unbiased in their perspective towards whether or not the proper grounding for morality is theism or not. I think that it would be an interesting discussion, and while we may not come to any conclusions on that, it's an interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah.
So
I have kind of a radical. Well, it's not radical, but I don't agree with anyone pretty much.
really, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
I don't
Yeah,
agree with the atheists, most
to,
of them, on morality, or the theists.
So are you a moral
We can
realist?
go on with the evidence.
I just want we can sort of touch on moral realism first, I guess.
Okay.
Would you say you would be a moral realist at believing that morality that moral facts do exist?
Yes.
All right. We do agree there, as do
Yeah.
the majority of philosophers. So would you say that? I guess I'll just let you expound on your view. Just wondering.
Well, the simplest way, I actually stumbled upon the phrasing while talking with Nephilim. It's basically just an ethic is a standard of behavior, and to violate that standard of behavior would be immoral within the internal workings of that system. But I'm contending that there is a system that is also consistent, objectively consistent with reality and logic. And so violating that system would not only be internally immoral, but it would also be objective to reality. I think, but that was just kind of the simplified version I came up with.
That's quite a bit to take in there. So I guess I just
Yeah.
asking some basic questions and seeing where you fall. So would you say morality would be something that you can reason to?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the question of atheism or theism is completely irrelevant because you heard what I was trying to.
I could potentially agree with that. There are plenty of theists who would not argue for the traditional divine command theory view, but would say that theism is in a sense on par with moral fact, and that moral facts are necessary, just like God. So that I know that there are many competing views within both camps.
Yeah.
So would you say that these moral facts are? Would you extend them to both moral values and moral duties?
What is? Just clarify a little bit for what you mean.
A value would be something with like this is good, or like murder is wrong, something like that.
Versus what you should and should not do.
Versus obligations or duties, which are oughts.
I believe there's both.
All right. Do you think that they are contingent upon something else, or do you think that they're necessary, that they couldn't be any other way?
They're just products of logic, basically. You could say logic itself is kind of circular reasoning, but it's not, because self-evidence is not circular.
Okay.
People confuse them sometimes, but
yeah. Okay, I just had a thought. It's losing me, but I'm gonna find it again. But okay. So would you say that morality is would it be that way if embodied moral agents such as humans didn't exist? Would some of the moral values and duties that you reason to, would they be that way if humans didn't exist?
Yes, because if it's objective, it depends not on anyone's perspective.
Yes, yes. And so there, that totally bypasses any evolutionary happening to why we would reason to this. You're saying that it's beyond human activity completely. All right.
Well, there are reasons why evolution would conform to these truths.
Mm-hmm. That's
Are you a creationist or evolutionist? I think you said you were kind of on the fence.
the thing is, I know that either side could argue me in if like they tried. So like, I'm interested in the subject, but I feel like either way I would feel gullible to accept either one right now, as I haven't studied the science, and I've only looked into like some of the specific polemical arguments. Like I do want to take an evolutionary biology class, and I do want to like study the actual sciences more before I come to a conclusion.
Yeah. Well, there's an easy shortcut. There's an easy shortcut because the scientists who believe in evolution have created technology, and the creationists have not.
Well, again,
Based on their knowledge,
creationists would argue some of them.
There may have been a creationist who worked on some science, but the creationist theory did not contribute to that science.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
I would say that from my knowledge, neo-Darwinism is in quite a bit of trouble. So I'm not. I think I would tend towards rejecting neo-Darwinism, but being more agnostic on common descent. The mechanism is.
What is neo-Darwinism?
Neo-Darwinism is essentially that purely random mutation and natural selection are guiding the process.
All right. Well, maybe we should talk about that a different time.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a long subject.
That is a.
But good to know.
Good to know. But I'm definitely open. I don't think that any sort of theistic belief depends on it in either way.
Yeah, it's totally. The only thing is the young Earth creationists need it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we were talking about moral
yeah, I think
obligations.
I was just talking about if it was grounded in human sources or not.
Yeah.
So this just happens to really coincide with a moral argument that has recently been given by Christian philosophers for theism, and I think you accept all the premises. I just want to make sure it's a bit of a novel argument. It's not the traditional moral argument. I wanted we could go premise by premise and see what you think of it.
Okay, can you post it so I can see it somehow?
I just have a screenshot.
Or is it? I could just write it down too.
Yeah, sure. I'll just
short.
write it out on the thing here.
Okay.
We'll go premise by premise here.
All right.
One.
Premise one.
Morality is a rational enterprise.
All
right. So essentially, morality is something that we can reason to, and I think we both agree with that. Yes. Premise two is traditionally known as the most controversial premise among philosophers, though that has changed a little bit in recent years, and that's moral realism is true, meaning moral facts and moral duties exists.
Yeah, I'll agree. I agree.
I'm just going to write it out so we've got it for reference here. Exist. Premise three is that the moral problems. This is probably where they're going to be where our disagreement is. The moral problems or potential disagreement. I'm not sure how I feel about the premise, but I tend towards accepting it. The moral problems and disagreements among humans are too much for us to assume that moral duties are grounded in a human source of morality. Let me write it out, and then
I don't like the way it's worded because I know where it's going. Because it's trying to say it's grounded in a higher reality
well,
or a higher than a human.
sort of.
Too much to assume moral duties are grounded in.
And let me more. It's too much because of all the ethical problems and all the disagreement. It's too much to assume that moral facts and duties are grounded in a human source of rationality.
I would just change it maybe to say humans are not the source of rationality. I mean, is that the same thing?
Humans are not the source of rationality. That humans are not the So this isn't actually arguing just for God. This is arguing that there is a necessary rational source from the three premises. So from premise one, you get that morality is grounded in a rational source.
Well, something creates rationality. I'm willing to agree with that.
So
It obviously comes from
I'm not
somewhere.
exactly sure what you just said. That wasn't what I was saying. That morality is a rational enterprise means that rationality comes from some sort of rational source, as in,
yeah,
that just follows from what from agreeing with the premise.
Yeah.
Then moral realism means that it's grounded in a that gets the argument off the ground, essentially, to say that this is indeed a question to be asked and that moral facts mean something. And premise three gets you to a necessary source, because if it was a contingent source, it would just be relying upon what other humans think, and it would essentially betray moral realism in saying that morality was grounded in some sort of human source, that it ultimately depends on human existence. And I think you disagree with that, right?
Yeah, it doesn't depend on humans.
Okay. So what we've got then is a rational, necessary source of morality. So I guess the difference would be in what we think that source is. So what would
does it really mean? What does it really mean by the moral problems and disagreements are too much?
Essentially, that the differences we have and the gray areas of morality, are too much for humans to account for by themselves. That we haven't come up with the we didn't come up with the moral code.
Is that to say that they're incapable of it, or just that they haven't yet?
That by principle they can't be the ones to have invented it.
I think they can discover it, but they are not the inventors.
We agree on. I think
Okay.
It's fun. Like, I see what you're saying there with regards to, maybe in the future we will be able to understand things more and be able to come up with better ethical theories.
Yeah, we're always getting closer.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that our approach towards better ethical theories, the moral progress, is it actually a really good argument for moral realism? That the fact that we're heading towards something better is good evidence for there being an objective standard of good.
So I think I can agree to premise 3, but the wording just seems a little off to me. Maybe
that's fair. I don't really love the way it's stated in this present form. So what would you say grounds that morality then?
Well, the morality is grounded in rationality and logic. I'm not sure what grounds that. Perhaps you can just say it's self-evident because the products of logic work.
That's how we discover it. It being self-evident is our moral epistemology. That that explains how we get to that morality. It doesn't explain where that objective standard comes from.
Yeah, I have no idea what the
Um,
source of it is.
so I would essentially say that the rational necessary source would improve the intrinsic probability or the prior probability of theism, because if there is a source of morality that is um, existing beyond essentially beyond essentially human proportions, and moral realism is true, that makes perfect sense if theism is true. But we wouldn't really expect that if naturalism was true. Would you agree with that or not?
We wouldn't expect. Sorry, I cut out for a second.
All right,
We couldn't expect what?
That it is not unexpected on theism that morality would be grounded in a necessary rational source.
I think it's expected of any system.
All right, but I'm just talking about the intrinsic probability of theism, with regards to showing that a concept like God could potentially account for a system of morality.
Does it increase the probability of theism?
It increases the prior probability, so it's not evidence for theism, but it increases the modesty of the God hypothesis. It makes it one less way in which the God hypothesis could fail.
Yeah, I suppose so.
So, like, by showing that if let's just say like a basic ontological argument would work. This works in the same way. In saying that the prior probability of theism is increased because if we can show that something like this exists in reality, a necessary rational source, or in the case of the ontological argument, a maximally great being, if we can show that a being like this exists within reality, or that something like this exists in reality, that is one less way theism could fail. If we didn't have moral realism, theism could fail in an extra way by saying that how could God exist if he's not the source of good?
Sure.
All right, and that will be relevant. I'm saying that it's relevant to the prior probability, not the evidence. So we'll get into that when I get to the prior probability of theism as a whole.
Right.
So I don't think we really disagree that much on objective morality. What would you? I don't understand what Neff and you are debating with regards to morality. That I don't see how the disagreement arose.
Okay, so what I was saying was that God, if God exists, he's going to base his morality on rationality, because his morality is not just going to be just randomness, whatever. Like, do you play the Elder Scrolls games? Do you know
Yes.
the God of Madness? He's not just going to just pick random rules out of nowhere.
Out of
The guy, yeah, Shalgarath, or he's just crazy, and he has no logic to him. I believe that a perfect God would have logic to them, and thus their morality would be logical, and thus I didn't want to say it exists outside of him, but it exists beyond him if you still want to assume God. So it doesn't matter if God is there, or if you know God or see God or know anything about God. All this logic is still available to us anyway. And it's the same logic that God used.
It depends on how one views God's nature. if God is by very nature good, and in the definition of God, goodness is included goodness and rationality as a God's rationality would come from being an unembodied mind with knowledge, right? Like that's where rationality would come from if God exists in God's mind. Like if God exists, he gets that rationality from his own nature. You'd agree with that or no?
I think his nature would have to conform to rationality, because even God cannot make a stone that he cannot move.
Yeah, right. But that would just mean that God would would have to conform to the the laws of logic. I don't think that that's really a problem for theism. Do you?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay.
But
the divine command theory is subjective morality.
How is it subjective morality?
Because if it's just the will of God, that's just might equals right. It's I win because I'm stronger. I get to decide just because, and
Well,
I decide on a whim.
but it's saying that in God's personality description, goodness would be part of what God is. Like it's not something God does or God adheres to. It's part of what God is.
that's fine. But in order to be objective, it needs to be true outside of any subject. And God is
Unless God is goodness, which is the subject.
if he has goodness and logic
Essentially built
inside.
into his nature.
Then I would that shifts me to the question of I don't see why that couldn't exist without God.
I don't necessarily disagree. But I think that theism is at least a plausible model for explaining why goodness exists. If God does indeed exist.
Well, I think good would exist whether there was God or not, as long as there's rationality.
How are you defining goodness? Because I would define goodness as God.
Goodness is defined as something that's relatively better in comparison to another thing.
Right, which would be perfect with God's nature being the greatest possible being. I'm not saying it's not compatible with naturalism. All I'm saying is that it's compatible with theism, the idea of
it's compatible.
reality. So yeah, I don't think that there's any real disagreement here, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Well, I just don't see God as being necessary to be the standard of logic or goodness.
I don't necessarily disagree. I don't necessarily endorse any moral argument for theism.
So, like, the closest I can kind of come to any convincing argument is just to say that perhaps there was something like an intelligence that moved the Big Bang, that moved causation to exist.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't reason anywhere from there that it wasn't multiple gods, or just it wasn't a god. It was just a mind-like impulse.
All right, we'll get in.
Or maybe it wasn't a mind at all.
Well, yeah, we'll definitely get into that with. I guess we'll move on then to the prior probability of theism. And just for those who are, and maybe you, I don't know if you understand Bayes' theorem.
Maybe.
It's essentially the probability calculus of how I evaluate evidence. It's the probability of any given hypothesis is going to depend on two factors: the likelihood ratio and the prior odds. So the prior probability is the number you assign to a hypothesis before you look at the evidence. And in philosophy of science, this is generally known as what is the simpler hypothesis. This more simple hypothesis is to be preferred. The more modest hypothesis is to be preferred.
Yeah.
and that's the general force behind prior probability, and it's the hypothesis most in accord with accepted facts. And then you multiply that by the probability of the evidence on the hypothesis being true over the probability of the evidence if the hypothesis is false. I can give a little. I can probably paste a picture in there of Bayes' theorem.
Okay.
In the thing, just for a reference. Let's see if that works. It does not. All right. I'll just write it out.
So what I was meaning to say, I want to go on a little bit about my standard for objective good.
Mhm.
And I mean, at some point, it is just completely arbitrary because you're just picking a word. But what we mean by good is by objective good is having an objective higher quantity of quality. And that works across all definitions of good. So
Higher
what that
quality and quant. Okay.
higher quantity of quality. And so what that essentially means is a higher probability out of the system to do anything. So the more stuff the system can do, the more probable positions it has, the more freedom it has, the more goodness it has, essentially. And I kind of explain that by, in order for anything, like if you're taking an if-then statement, something has to exist. So, and that is of a higher quantity of qualities than non-existence. So non-existence
Yes, this is
is
great.
going into bad.
Uh-huh.
Because that's the baseline of everything. So, and just the existence of something that has qualities increases the goodness.
Properties, right? Properties.
Yeah, you can call them properties or qualities.
Yeah. Man, you are describing God so well right now. It's great.
But I don't see any personality to it.
I'm saying right. I would say that you'd get that from other factors
Okay.
of the evidence. But I would push you on the moral duties, especially. If moral obligations exist, what is the naturalist obligated to? Like, you don't have moral obligations to a non-rational source.
I think, I'm not sure if there are any, with one exception, which is to your children. You have a positive duty to your children because you have created them without their consent. And so you logically owe them something. Otherwise, I think you only have a negative duty to not infringe on the freedoms of other people, which essentially would decrease the freedom of the system.
Yeah, I suppose we could probably think of more duties, but you only need one in order for the example to hold. So what would your obligation be to? Like, when you're obligated to do something, you're obligated for somebody usually.
Yeah.
So in the case of being good to your children, what are you accountable to in that sense of morality?
Well, you're just accountable to logic. I mean, if you can get away with it. But you're accountable to your child. You're accountable to everyone who loves that child. You're accountable to the police of your area and your society.
And so you think that moral guilt exists?
What do you mean by that?
Like, the idea if you fail to be in proper, the reason that you feel bad after killing somebody is because it was genuinely wrong, and you feel guilt from that internally, right?
You would. I mean, it depends on who you are. You would feel guilt.
I'm talking about like a general person.
Yeah.
Who engages in.
I mean, depending on the level of self-deception you're in, and how it fits into your worldview, blah blah blah.
Right. I'm talking about like just.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah. That's why I suppose I find theism a satisfying explanation, for why one feels that moral guilt, or why that feels it's such a strong duty to protect children. And it's not necessarily that naturalism is incompatible with it. I just think that theism as a personal explanation seems to be in accord with guilt in every other circumstance. Like, if you steal out of the cookie jar, you're guilty because of your mom and dad that you disobeyed them, essentially. So I would say that theism is a satisfying explanation for me for why we feel such moral duties and moral guilt, and I don't really see a comparable one for the naturalist, though I wouldn't really press the point.
Well, I mean, I always go with the simplest explanation that requires the least moving parts. So, since I can explain all that through evolution, and I mean, you can explain it more simply with just that's a natural adaptation. So I don't need God to explain
You wouldn't say
it.
that.
Let me unpack it if you
Sure.
need to. Basically, the same moral truths that exist in what the ether of that aren't actually material, they will materialize because you can't run a society on murder. You can't spread genes on murder. Well, at least of your own genes, that is.
Right.
So all the animals that want to murder their own kind are going to either kill themselves off or get themselves killed. And so what's left is animals that behave in a rational or moral manner, even if they have no idea what they're doing.
So it seems with regards to duties, you punted to evolution of why we would feel that way. And I would say that then that wouldn't be an objective. Well, I would say that morality is contingent upon evolution bringing about embodied moral agents.
But I don't even need like the really formal scientific type of evolution. I can just say no society which was based on like completely illegitimate logic and morality could have survived.
That does beg the question of why society, why the importance of society matters. And I think that the best naturalist move is just to look at it pragmatically, but then you sort of are saying that it's not that morality is not objective.
No, morality is objective.
So it's not contingent. Moral duties are not contingent upon evolution.
No, but evolution would conform to these natural truths.
Yeah, I might have misunderstood something you said there. I thought you said something like we feel our that moral obligation, and we feel the failure of moral obligation because of evolution. That's the reason why we acknowledge it.
I think I phrased it like that when I was trying to get my thoughts out real fast.
But wouldn't that make that moral duty completely dependent and contingent upon evolution instead of it being objective, essentially in the ether?
No, because the way evolution worked is contingent upon basic moral truths.
So
And
evolution.
it's not going to get it perfect because evolution is not an intelligent source. But things that don't work aren't going to spread genes, and morality is based on similar logic.
Right, but how would you say that the societal implications are important in the grand scheme of things?
Oh, well, if it's just you, there's no one else to consider. You can do whatever you want if it's just you. But if there's someone else there,
Even if it was just you, would you still have that duty? And like,
to plants and animals in the earth, you
okay.
would be doing less damage. probably.
Right. I don't really see any strict disagreement there. I just think that theism is a satisfying explanation for why we feel that certain way, but I certainly wouldn't use it to ground belief or anything like that.
But I don't see God as a necessary part, so I just don't
But
feel.
I see where you come from a naturalist perspective in the first place. I see what you're saying there. I wouldn't challenge that.
But I don't know if it's even naturalist, really, because you can still argue without any science
Yeah.
that a society based on murder or a society based on theft, it's just not going to work as well.
Mm-hmm.
Same as if you don't take care of yourself or your hygiene, you're going to get sick. It is morally virtuous to take a shower. I mean, it's not the
For the purpose of society.
greatest thing in the world, but well, just for your self-care.
Okay. Interesting.
At
I'll have
the
to
very
think about
least.
that. I'll have to rewind the tape and really think about the viewer percentage because I can't think of any surface problems I have with it. But yeah, I'll have to think it over. I'd prefer not to just think about it the entire time here and
No, that's okay. Yeah, we'll talk again.
yeah, for sure. So anyway, to the prior probability of theism, we're evaluating the hypothesis's simplicity, essentially. Would you say that before looking at the evidence, like let's say we had someone who had no sense perceptions, would theism or naturalism seem more probable before looking at the evidence? Which one seems more modest and simple?
For someone who has no senses?
Like for someone completely coming into this debate blind with someone who hasn't studied any evidence.
Okay. What would I think they would say?
What do you think is more um, uh, probable, essentially?
That they would believe?
Not necessarily. I'm probably not explaining that in the best way, but what would you say? Which hypothesis?
Never been raised with either belief or.
No, that's not really the direction I'm going in. But which which hypothesis do you think is more modest?
The naturalist one has less moving parts because the theist one naturally has to include everything in reality plus God and all the supernatural stuff.
All right. So I would essentially disagree with there. And then I'll offer a reason for thinking that theism is a really simple hypothesis, and thus it's at least to be on equal ground with naturalism. The big reason is that naturalism, and I'm just defining naturalism as non-theism. That's generally how it's defined in the literature. Also presupposes the hypothesis of an indifferent universe. And
well,
that is an extra assumption that needs to be made of.
But I don't think it assumes it. It just doesn't make an assumption either way. And the default is, well, if you can't prove it's there, then we're just going to assume. Well, we don't assume it's not there. We just don't assume it is.
We don't assume that it is. So that would be a point of neutrality with regard to prior probability. All right.
At least for myself, even as an anti-theist, I don't assume that there is no God. I just have not been convinced that there is.
Okay. So with regards to the prior probability, I don't see you really saying that God is this extraordinary thing that has all these built-in assumptions and is very improbable before looking at any of the evidence. Would you say that your idea of the prior probability is relatively moderate? That both seem to make that theism may have one extra claim but on in terms of probability, they're not too far different? Or would you say that theism has so many different claims and so many different ideas that it is not modest?
Depends on what God.
I'm
The most blanket possible term of theism, just the idea that there is a God, then that's just one extra proposition, I think.
okay. So I would define classical theism as God being the greatest possible being who is uh, a, a person, essentially, which is just a mind, who possesses two real properties that are of importance, which is power and knowledge, and that God exists not contingently upon anything else, but that God is necessary. That would be my definition of theism.
Okay.
Uh,
I mean, there's probably like a few claims in there, but I think it's
okay.
basically just one.
Okay, so you wouldn't say that on the outset theism is massively improbable.
Not with all the qualifiers that religions bring to it, or not without.
I'm just talking about classical theism, which is God is being. Okay, and one reason for thinking that God is a modest hypothesis is because these quantities of power that God has of power and knowledge, they aren't some large degree that's finite. Making them limitless is a really is a simple way of going about it. And thus I think theism has a moderate prior probability because it doesn't really make a lot of claims, and it's not really making any bold claims about like the number, the degree of God's power, or God's knowledge. It's talking in a very generalized, limitless form of power. So it doesn't need some sort of uh, huge explanation that has a lot of complex parts.
Well, I mean, I don't know how you could know that.
Know the definition?
I don't know how you could know whether it was limitless or whether that limitlessness was simple or complex. Because I think, even if it's just one extra proposition, it would seem to me that the creator of all things and the definition of good and the most powerful and all-knowing being, that seems a little complex to me.
That's only like two claims essentially. Having all power and knowledge is a lot more modest than saying that God has some degree, like really, like just think about a really high number degree of power and a really high degree of knowledge. Like we think that a lot of scientific theories are simple because gravity is essentially limitless in the sense that there aren't exceptions to the power of it.
Yeah, but it would seem like all the particles and the energy, or God would seem not simple to me because he is everything and all things plus a little bit more.
All things and everything and a little bit more.
Or maybe a lot more.
So I would say God is simple because these degrees are like a limitless degree is much less complex than a really high degree, right? Like if
limitless degree would include a bunch of high degrees.
I didn't hear. Sorry, I talked over you there.
Wouldn't something that's limitless be something that's high and more?
No,
it just keeps going on and on and on.
there would be no exceptions to it. Like, and a good way to illustrate this would be like a graph that has a really high number of points on the graph is a lot more complex than a graph that simply goes on forever. A graph that is infinite, a graph that's exceptionless.
I don't know. Maybe this helps. Are you kind of looking at it like, I don't know if you've seen anything about the higher dimensions, whereas if you go up higher in a dimension, it's like connecting 2 points. And so the lower dimension is just all the higher dimensions condensed into a single point. And I think maybe you're looking at it like God is the first binary point of which everything else is derived. Like we can derive all this computer code from just ones and zeros. Is that kind of what you mean?
Generally, I'm sure that sort of analogy falls apart at a certain level, but I think that you're on the right track there.
Okay. But if you're getting that simple, like I think of the universe that way, and there's really no other word for it than God, but it doesn't feel like a good word. There's no good word for it, because to me God needs to include personality. And if you're going down to the source code of the entire universe, it's going to be simple and it's going to have all the power of the universe, but it's not going to. I don't see where the sentience comes from.
Right. It wouldn't have degrees of power or knowledge because it wouldn't be personal. It wouldn't have that the properties of knowledge or power, because knowledge and power come from having free will, essentially.
So where is the God?
Where is the God?
Like, weren't you saying there is a personal God?
Yeah, that God is an unembodied mind who possesses these two properties, which are power and knowledge, and all of them flow from that. And he's necessary, obviously.
So is he a property of this base property of the universe?
No, I would say that.
Like it builds in complexity and creates a God?
I'm not really grasping what you're saying there.
Well, with my analogy that I was trying to talk about with the dimensions and the computer codes is like.
I have about 20 minutes, by the way, just letting you know.
Okay. So it's not that God is the simplistic building blocks that create everything else.
I think building blocks would be I would say that God is a personal being who does things and knows things.
All right, so maybe we're getting off. Seems like we're talking past each other a little bit.
Yeah, I think we are.
Yeah, I just don't see where the personality comes from. And
in my definition, you don't see where personhood comes from into the definition of God.
Well, I understand your definition, but where is that manifested in reality?
His intentionality. That's what it would be. That he would choose to do specific things, and that he would have thoughts. That would be that's where the knowledge would come from.
But I mean, so he needs to have a location or either be everywhere all at once.
I would generally tend to everywhere at once, but I don't think that God would have the location because he'd be an unembodied mind, not any sort of physical material thing that would be incredibly complex. That would be that would be completely writing off the idea of theism, in my opinion, if God was some sort of physical being.
But I'm just having trouble understanding the concept of just disembodied intentions that exist but don't exist, but you can't point to them. They're nowhere, but they're everywhere. And what do these intentions do, and where do they come from? These are all the unanswered questions.
So it's a couple of those I don't think are questions. Like I don't think where it comes from and what he does really are questions to ask in that sense. But so it seems like you're having trouble with the concept of an unembodied mind. Is that essentially what you're?
Well, I need something that holds it, whether it's a spiritual dimension or something. Yeah, I guess I don't understand how something can exist but not have a correlating substance of some kind, whether it's matter or a spiritual
Right,
something.
God would be, God's nature would ground that realm is a horrible word for this, but sort of realm of existence.
And it exists like parallel to ours.
I don't really have an opinion on that, but I do think
Like, is he a spirit?
there can be causal reactions from God upon the physical world in some sense.
But even for me to conceive of like a spirit, it's got to have like some kind of ectoplasm or something.
That does seem to just presuppose naturalism, though, doesn't it? That there's got to be some sort of space and matter.
I don't know. I don't think it presupposes it. It's just you have no. I can't conceive of it.
All right, so you can't conceive of yourself without a brain. Like you can't conceive yourself without a body.
I can, but I can't conceive how that would work.
How it would work.
Yeah.
I think that you're
what would I be made out of?
You'd be like
Where
you would be
the thought itself would have a dimension to it.
Right, which would be grounded in your own nature. Which would be grounded in your own nature of an unembodied mind. You'd be made out of assumes matter essentially.
So it would be matter.
No, it wouldn't be matter. I would say that to ask what you would be made out of is a nonsensical question. The same would be said of God, because they aren't defined by what they are made out of. They are defined by what they are.
Well, the only thing we know of like that is just a concept, which doesn't act. It's not self-aware. It's only communicating.
Like a necessary source, something like an abstract object, something like a foundation. Which
But they only exist as concepts within our minds, and we can just communicate them with symbols. But
what would you?
There's not some abstract concept as a spirit floating between us.
Floating between us seems to just assume physical space. Doesn't
But that's the space we live in.
Yes.
I mean, we know of nothing else.
Like the disconnect is coming here because I can easily conceive of just an unembodied mind. Essentially, I can easily conceive of something with thoughts but no body, so something that doesn't occupy space.
That helps me understand a little bit more, because it's difficult to conceive of your own non-existence.
Well,
for me at least, I find it almost impossible.
I can conceive of my own non-existence. It's just it's I'm trying to figure out a way to bridge the gap here, because I have another idea in my mind, which is panentheism, which is essentially the idea that God is some form of immaterial energy. Does that sort of
yeah, but even the
like as an energy? I know it's not a perfect the Orthodox Church would admit that, but they
That
often
helps a little,
energies.
but our concept, or the popular conception of energy, is in fact just flat out wrong. That's not like you will see a glowing substance come off like a wizard's hand or something.
Right, that is wrong. Yes, that is absolutely wrong. Yes.
Yeah, energy's more just. I have trouble describing it, but I can conceive of it. It's more of a potential. But I don't.
So then
I don't
say
see where that can turn into intelligence.
give that thought and uh, show that it has intentionality. That's really all it is. In that, God is an energy in some sense.
But that energy would still exist somewhere, or be stored somewhere, somehow.
Right.
Like
But
I play with concepts.
Right. There's something that's fundamental.
Yeah.
Something that's fundamental in reality. That there's like the bounds of the outside of the bounds of the universe. There's nothing, because the idea of nothing would be fundamental if naturalism is true. In the same way that theism, outside of the universe, which is a little bit of an improper way of describing it, because again, you're just talking about physical space. That there would be a separate spiritual dimension. I guess dimension was the word I was looking for before with regards to energy. Does the idea of another dimension help alleviate your issue there?
It helps me understand it better, but I still don't see any proof or
I don't
evidence.
think that can be demonstrated through pure reason. I don't think that the idea that God exists in all these, like that God, I don't think that human minds can conceive of more than 3 dimensions.
Well,
I think
mean, we have ways,
right.
I can sort of. Well, we actually do. We think fourth dimensionally because we understand time. We can almost live
Oh yeah,
in the past and present. It's hard once it gets a little higher than that. Fifth dimensional is kind of like all time at once, but also branching time.
I would also say the same thing of abstract objects, or you'd say the same thing of God as abstract objects. Like abstract objects are really difficult to conceive of. Like it's hard to conceive of numbers. It's hard to conceive of sets. It's hard to conceive of the laws of thought floating around in reality. Like there's something fundamental about them all. Like that they are grounded in a necessary source.
So you think there's like a
Grounded in
spiritual
their own nature. They're grounded in their own nature, not in time, space, and matter.
there's like a spiritual equivalent to the number 3?
I'm undecided with regards to abstract objects, but many philosophers think that numbers do exist in reality, like as an abstract object that is grounded in their own nature.
Well, they behave according to the laws of logic, and we can label them, and we can demonstrate that that label is consistent and accurate. Like,
Right, it's more talking about the symbols of numbers, though. They're talking about an actual concept of a set existing in reality, or even like the laws of logic exist in this way, in a necessary way, that they're grounded in their own nature.
well, it's kind of like, I mean, if you stack 3 rocks in a row, it's 3 rocks, but the rocks don't know it. The universe doesn't know it. It doesn't care. 3 only has a meaning to the person who's counting.
Can you say that again? I did not hear any. I did not hear any that. You completely cut out from my mic.
Oh, sorry. I don't think I'm hitting anything. So you can demonstrate math and numbers in reality with physical processes. You can stack 3 rocks in a row, but the rocks don't know there's 3. The universe doesn't know there's 3. There's no threeness about them. It's
Well,
just the 3 only matters. The 3 only matters to the person who's counting.
That's what a lot of philosophers disagree with, that there's no threeness to them, that there's no extra essence to them, that they're not grounded in their own nature. That well, okay, so I'm trying to see what you're thinking here. So how do you think the laws of logic are grounded in their own nature?
It's tough to understand what that means, but at some point,
That they're fundamental,
something is self-creating.
they're necessary.
Like, you can't avoid the infinite regression problem. At some point, the universe
Yes, I get
created
it.
itself. I think it behaves by the laws of logic, which are the only laws it can behave by. And
Right, with the laws of logic, which would be fundamental, essentially. They're not floating
Yeah.
around somewhere, but they exist.
yeah,
That's not too far from where I think God is, in that
Okay.
ether of floating around. I just don't like the terminology there, but
yeah, because these rules and these logic math exists, but it doesn't exist. There's no mathness of the universe, but we can still.
well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I might agree with that, but
Yeah, I guess
that is one of the more that's one of the more
but these rules still
controversial
exist.
areas of modern uh, metaphysics today, whether or not abstract objects like numbers exist in independent of anything.
I think in a way they do, but the way that we understand it is totally symbolic. We're just barely
Because we don't
constructing a raft
Sure.
that works.
necessary existence. We like, it goes back to the infinite regress. We can't conceive of what it ultimately means to be a necessary thing grounded in its own nature, but we can see that some of those things exist.
Well, the best I've come up with is like why is there anything? Well, there has to be something or else there'd be nothing. And this
Would you? But yeah,
and thus nothing would happen. So there has to be something.
Yeah. And
Like
you
absolute nothingness is so hard.
You would say the universe.
Sorry, go ahead.
Would you say the universe is what is necessary?
There's something necessary about it.
Right. And that's what one of the really interesting things in metaphysics today is that they're trying that there are many arguments with regards to what that necessary source is. So would you agree with the contingency argument, which says that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, and that that is either grounded in the necessity of its own nature and or an external cause, and that therefore there is a cause to the universe that is either explained in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause?
Probably, but when you're getting down to the fundamental why anything exists at all, it's I don't know if we can answer that.
I suspect that you'll go to saying eventually that the universe is necessary, right? Would you say the universe is necessary?
Yeah.
Okay. That I don't find intellectually satisfying for a number of reasons. But I guess I can quickly get into them. I'm pushing time a little bit. But I
You
guess
can go ahead. I mean,
we can get into it a
kind of
little
came
bit.
to an understanding, but if you got a little bit more
I
time.
have to head out pretty soon.
Okay.
I'll just give my 4 reasons for thinking that the universe being necessary isn't intellectually satisfying. One
So
is,
you don't think the universe is necessary?
no, I think that the universe is grounded in God, who is the necessary source. One is that I think the universe had a beginning. for various philosophical reasons, essentially, but that's also grounded in the science. I think the science confirms it. I wouldn't argue from the science of just the Big Bang, because I think that we need a theory of quantum gravity first to really understand it. But I think that the science is consistent with the philosophical arguments that the universe indeed had a beginning, and thus things that have a beginning can't be necessary. They're contingent upon it, something causing them to come into existence. And then I think that the universe is composed of too many parts for it to be a necessary thing. I feel like the universe is contingent, and that
I,
it's too complex. I think it's too complex to be the foundation of reality.
well, I mean, as I understand it, the Big Bang was not the beginning of the universe. It was just a continuation of
They don't
some
really.
form.
No one really knows.
Yeah,
Um,
but
but I think that the philosophical arguments for the impossibility of traversing an infinite are indeed is a good argument for the universe having an absolute beginning. And if the universe had an absolute beginning, I would say that it was caused by something, because I think that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in a cause. And given that the universe, I would say, isn't necessary, I would say that it had a cause.
well, you mentioned it was too big and too complex, but at the time of the Big Bang, it was not. It was all condensed in one area. And for me, it's easier to conceive of a universe that is necessary and contingent on itself, even like what are the simple building blocks of the universe, than
So,
it is to believe the universe is plus God.
so you would, but you agree that everything has an explanation of its existence?
Uh, yeah, but when you're talking about why anything exists at all, I don't know if there is an explanation, but it would seem like it should. It like there's some answer as to why nothingness doesn't occur.
Yeah, we would
But I can't confirm that. So
we would agree on that, and that's why there's so many things that I want to get into here, but I'm just
yeah,
trying to do something quick I could say here. And then my other thing is that I think that it's relatively easy to conceive of a universe not existing. Like I can conceive of. Can you conceive of nothingness?
no, and that's why I think
That's
that that's why I think existence is necessary.
that's another. Yeah,
Because
that's
because if you think about true nothingness,
the absence of anything.
you can't nothing can occur. I don't know how to express myself exactly, but it just doesn't make any sense that
That nothing would.
true nothingness, because even the physical nothingness we've understood
Right.
becomes
That
matter
just.
and antimatter and
Yeah.
energy. Um, it's just it has no possibility, and thus there could be nothing. And so the evidence that the fact that there is something means that there never was nothing. I don't know. That's kind of what makes sense to me.
That there never was nothing. But then
Because if it was truly nothing, nothing could ever occur.
I would agree with this as a theist. um, I think the problem is giving arguments for the universe's necessity. You've said a number of times that it had to exist. There had to be something. Like
Well, it's
I
here.
just don't find that I don't think that intuition is correct, for one, and then also the numerous philosophical arguments for a beginning that I think are good, but I don't have time to get into.
Okay. Well,
So I suppose we should wrap it up in some way here.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I just
you have
think
any closing thoughts, or
if since we exist, uh there had to have been something always, because if it was nothingness, then nothing could have ever occurred and nothing would have ever eventually become something. And thus, I think since we exist, we have to exist.
all right. Um, and to that, I would again respond to my. I mean, I would again respond with my 4 reasons for thinking the universe isn't necessary, but I can't really unpack them now. So I really enjoyed this discussion. I think there was some good clarification on hell.
Yeah.
There was some good clarification on hiddenness. Unfortunately, we couldn't really get into the inductive evidence for theism, but I mean, once again, I was telling my friends last night that that there was no way we were going to be able to cover everything we wanted to because, I mean, it takes so many hours and hours and hours, and we're trying to cover a whole field of philosophical study.
Yeah. We're just scratching the surface.
For sure, like
We covered a lot.
yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
I definitely want to get your thoughts on some of Josh Rasmussen stuff. I'll have to send it to you from email.
Sure.
If you want to give it a read.
Yeah.
You can do the same for me. I'm going to be asking you some questions about evolution in the near future too.
Did you say Josh Feuerstein?
No.
Okay.
Oh shoot! No, that'd be awful. No, Joshua Rasmussen is a Christian philosopher from a Zeus specific university who really deals in terms of the contingency argument a lot and discusses what we were discussing over the last 20 minutes. He's basically dedicated his entire academic service to it. So I'll send you to his channel that has a number of really good explanations of his papers. And I'll send you some stuff, and then I'll be asking you about evolution in the coming weeks as well.
All right. Sounds good.
Sounds good. It was great to meet you. Great to
Yeah, I'll talk to you later.
Absolutely.
See ya.
All right, and that is the conclusion of our discussion on the morality of Christian belief, and then briefly touching on the rationality of Christian belief. Make sure to tune into both of our channels. I'm not really active on mine too much, but I suspect that Snake Was Right is going to be coming out with some more content. So my subscribers definitely subscribe to him. And yeah, great discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.